I hold fast to the notion that there are sacred texts other than those found within our Bible. Texts which we encounter in our everyday lives. I believe the 8-year-old's handcrafted Mother's Day card from crayons and markers and displaying a barely legible "I love you" is a sacred text. Just as sacred as the courageous coming out letter written with sweaty hands by the 22-year-old lesbian to her parents. The words "hungry will work for food" written on a piece of cardboard and held up by someone who has been stripped of their dignity but not their will to survive. That piece of cardboard is a sacred text. And I believe the book An Altar in the World by Barbara Brown Taylor is also a sacred text. That's why I chose an excerpt from it as this morning's first reading, and why I'll be referencing the book frequently in my reflections this morning on our gospel text. In her book, she reveals several meaningful ways to discover the sacred in the small things we do and see. Something as ordinary as hanging clothes on a clothesline becomes an act of meditation if we pay attention to what we're doing and taking time to notice the sights, smells, and sounds around us. She talks about 12 different holy practices in her book, but I only want to highlight 3 of them this morning as they pertain to our gospel reading. The practice of encountering others, the practice of paying attention, and the practice of pronouncing blessings. Because you see, that's what I think we find in our gospel reading. We find Jesus involved in a series of holy practices, the first of which is an encounter of another. Taylor writes that encountering others is the practice of coming face to face with another human being, preferably someone different enough to qualify as a capital O other, and at least entertaining the possibility that this is one of the faces of God. The next time you go to the grocery store, she writes, try engaging the cashier. You don't have to invite her home for lunch or anything, but take a look at her face while she's trying to find arugula on her laminated list of produce. Here's someone who exists even when she is not ringing up your groceries, as hard as that may be for you to imagine. She is someone's daughter, maybe someone's mother as well. She has a home she returns to when she hangs up her apron here, a kitchen that smells of last night's supper, a bed where she occasionally lies awake at night wrestling with her own demons and angels. Don't go too far with this, or you risk turning her into a character in your own novel, which is a large part of her problem already. It's enough for you to acknowledge her when she hands you your change. You saved $11.06 by shopping at Winn-Dixie today, she says, looking right at you. All that's required of you is to look back. Just meet her eyes for a moment. When you know that she has been seen, not the cashier, but the person. But even if she doesn't seem to notice, the encounter has occurred. You noticed, and because you did, neither of you will ever be quite the same again. In our gospel reading, Jesus encounters a Roman centurion, not directly, but through the man's allies. The centurion was a military commander whose job it was to keep the peace among the Jews. To the average Jewish citizen, he would have represented everything despicable to them. He was the outsider, the Gentile, the overlord who had the power to make life miserable. He was the daily reminder that they were not a free people, but instead subjects of the Roman Empire. And he was also a philanthropist, making donations large enough to underwrite the construction of the local synagogue. It's a difficult place to be when you are indebted to the very person you despise. But I believe Jesus saw past all the outer trappings of the centurion. He looked past the religion, nationality, and tax bracket of the man and touched his humanity. And in so doing, he was able to also touch the divinity that is within each of us. All of us are created in God's image, an image which God declared in the very beginning to be very good. And that's what I believe Jesus saw in that uniformed military man on that day. But we resist these kinds of holy encounters, don't we? We want to get on with our lives. And who really has the time for this eye-to-eye encounter thing? Well, Jesus did. And when we also make time for encountering others, we will discover that we encounter more than people. We encounter God. But the key to a meaningful encounter is the pause that takes place afterward. The not checking our watch to see if we are late for our next appointment, but instead pausing long enough to realize the person that you have encountered is really and truly made in the image of God. Taylor calls this the practice of paying attention. She writes, reverence for creation comes fairly easily for most people. Reverence for other people presents more of a challenge, especially if those people's lives happen to impinge on my own. One remedy for my condition is to pay attention to them when I can, even when they are in my way. Just for a moment, I look for the human being instead of the obstacle. That boy who is crushing my portobellos doesn't know the first thing about mushrooms. He is what, 16 years old? With such a bad case of acne that it has to hurt when he lays his face on the pillow at night. His fingernails are bitten to the quick. He's working so hard to impress the pretty young cashier that it's no wonder he doesn't see me. But I see him. And for a moment, he is more than a bag boy. He is a kid with his own demons, his own bad skin, and budding lusts. I don't want too much information about any of this, but I can at least let him be more than a bit player in my drama. I pay attention to him, and the fist in my chest lets go. Jesus paid attention to the man who was asking for his help. The human part of him must have clenched up when he was being asked to heal the slave boy of the very symbol of Roman imperialism. But he also must have realized that the young boy was more than just a slave to the man. Something I'll be returning to in a few weeks and talking about in a bit more detail. But that realization only came from pausing long enough to experience the holy practice of paying attention. And when Jesus saw what he saw in this man, he pronounced a blessing. In her book, Taylor writes, to pronounce a blessing on something is to see it from the divine perspective. To pronounce a blessing is to participate in God's own initiative. To pronounce a blessing is to share God's own audacity. The world needs you to do this because there is a real shortage of people willing to kneel where they are and recognize the holiness. That we are able to bless one another at all is evidence that we have been blessed, whether we can remember when or not. That we are willing to bless one another is miracle enough to stagger the very stars. Jesus' blessing was heard in his proclamation of the man's faithfulness. I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. And it was out of that blessing that healing occurred. The man's slave was healed. There's a lot of healing that needs to take place in our world. And it's up to us to take on the job of making things better. And one way we do that is with our words of blessing, countering the flood of curses that abound around us. But we can't bless until we first encounter and then pay attention. We need to slow down, people. We need to slow down and remember that God has pronounced us all to be very good. And we need to be making the same pronouncements on each other. May we develop the holy practice of blessing others as we ourselves have been blessed by God. Amen.